The fate of a city can be sealed by its choices, the fate of a man by his decisions, and when these two factors collide, tragedy is inevitable. Today, we will revisit the story of a man who witnessed the destruction of an entire civilization, a man who faced the dilemma between comfort and righteousness. That man was Lot. His journey takes us to a city dominated by corruption, where God's judgment manifested in a terrible and unforgettable way. Prepare yourself to learn the story of a people surrendered to their own perversion, of a family torn between faith and survival, and of a judgment that has been etched forever in the history of humanity. Before we begin, don't forget to leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any content like this. Now let's dive into the story. The first mention of Lot in the Bible appears in the book of Genesis. He was Abraham's nephew and lost his father very early in life. Orphaned, he began to accompany his uncle on his journeys and adventures of faith. Together, they left Ur of the Chaldeans and set out for Canaan, the promised land. Over the years, both Abraham and Lot prospered. Their wealth and herds grew to such an extent that the land could no longer sustain both of them. Shepherds from both groups began to quarrel, and to avoid a greater conflict, Abraham proposed that they part ways. Generously, he allowed Lot to choose where he wanted to go first. Faced with the opportunity, Lot looked around and saw the fertile plains of the Jordan, a lush and promising place. Seduced by the land's prosperous appearance, he made his decision to settle in the city of Sodom. Lot's choice seemed advantageous from a material standpoint, but it overlooked a crucial factor. Sodom was a center of depravity and wickedness. Its inhabitants lived in a way completely opposed to the values taught by God. The city was a symbol of moral degradation, where sin and perversion had become common practices. Despite this, Lot established himself there and over time integrated into the local society. The Bible indicates that he even rose to a position of prominence within the city, sitting at the city gates, a place reserved for elders and leaders. But while Lot sought success in Sodom, Abraham remained in communion with God, and one day the Lord sent 3 mysterious visitors to him. They were angels disguised as men. Abraham, perceiving their extraordinary nature, received them with hospitality, offering them food and rest. During this encounter, shocking news was revealed. Sodom and its neighboring city Gomorrah were to be destroyed. The sin of these cities had reached an unbearable level, and God's judgment was about to be executed. Abraham, knowing both divine justice and mercy, dared to intercede for any righteous people who might be there. With courage and humility, he questioned, "If there are 50 righteous people in the city, will you still destroy it?" God replied that if there were 50 righteous, he would spare the city. But Abraham pressed on, reducing the number to 45, then 40, 30, 20, and finally 10. God agreed that if there were at least 10 righteous people, Sodom would not be destroyed. However, the sad reality was that not even 10 righteous could be found there. Meanwhile, the 2 angels sent by God arrived in Sodom at dusk. Lot was sitting at the city gate when he saw them, and recognizing their special nature, ran to greet them. Insistently, he invited them to spend the night at his house. At first, the visitors refused, saying they would sleep in the square. But Lot, well aware of the wickedness of the city's inhabitants, persisted until they accepted his hospitality. That night, the situation took a terrifying turn. All the men of Sodom, from the youngest to the oldest, surrounded Lot's house and demanded that he hand over the visitors so they could abuse them. The scene was a reflection of the absolute corruption of that society. Faced with the imminent threat, Lot tried to reason with the crowd, pleading with them not to commit such wickedness. In a desperate and controversial act, he even offered his own daughters in place of the visitors, attempting to appease the mob's fury. But the men of Sodom were blinded by their desire to sin and mocked Lot, threatening to break into the house by force. In the face of danger, the angels intervened. They pulled Lot back inside the house and shut the door, striking the men outside with blindness. Unable to find the entrance, the crowd dispersed. At that moment, the angels revealed to Lot the true reason for their visit. The city would be destroyed, and he and his family needed to leave immediately. But even in the face of such a dire warning, Lot hesitated. Attached to the life he had built, he was reluctant to abandon everything. The angels had to take him by the hand, along with his wife and daughters, and literally lead them out of the city. Before they left, they received a clear command: flee and do not look back. They were to escape to the mountains without letting themselves be consumed by what they were leaving behind. When they finally departed, divine judgment fell upon Sodom and Gomorrah. Fire and brimstone rained down from the sky, consuming everything. The destruction was total, a visible testament to God's wrath against corruption and sin. But as they fled, Lot's wife disobeyed the divine order. Driven by attachment to the city and the past, she looked back. In that instant, she was turned into a pillar of salt, a symbol of the consequences of disobedience and lack of trust in God's will. The tragedy didn't end there. After the destruction, Lot and his 2 daughters took refuge in a cave in the mountains. Isolated and fearing they would not find husbands to continue their lineage, Lot's daughters made a terrible decision. They got their father drunk and on 2 consecutive nights had relations with him. From this incestuous union were born 2 sons, Moab and Ben-Ammi, who later became the patriarchs of the Moabites and the Ammonites. Lot's story is marked by contrasts. He was righteous enough to be spared from destruction, but his choices led him to disastrous consequences. His pursuit of prosperity and comfort caused him to settle in a condemned place. His hesitation nearly cost him his life. His departure from Abraham's principles had a profound impact on his family. In the New Testament, the Apostle Peter mentions Lot as a man who suffered with the wickedness of Sodom, but was still rescued by God. His story serves as a powerful warning about the consequences of compromising faith for temporary gains. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah echoes to this day as a symbol of divine judgment against sin, and Lot, though he survived, paid a high price for his choices. May his story serve as a lesson for us to reflect on the decisions we make and the impact they can have, not only on our lives but also on future generations. Lot's story shows us how choices made solely based on appearances can lead to devastating consequences. From the moment he decided to dwell in Sodom, he was approaching danger without realizing it. The city was prosperous, its plains were fertile, and life there seemed promising. However, behind all that material prosperity lay an irreversible moral decay. Lot, in his pursuit of a comfortable life, ignored the warning signs and plunged into an environment that gradually corrupted everything around him. The Bible teaches us that what seems advantageous is not always the best choice. In Lot's case, his desire for stability caused him to overlook the spiritual dangers of living in Sodom. Unlike Abraham, who sought God's guidance for every decision, Lot acted based on his own perception. This mistake came at a high cost, for he not only lost everything he owned, but also saw his family fall apart. After escaping the destruction of Sodom, Lot took refuge in a small town called Zoar. However, even after being saved, he found no peace. Fear overtook him. Perhaps he was traumatized by the destruction he had witnessed. Perhaps he feared that God's judgment would extend to other cities. The fact is that instead of trusting in divine protection, Lot made a drastic decision. He fled to the mountains and isolated himself in a cave with his 2 daughters. This moment in Lot's story leads us to reflect on the impact of traumatic experiences on a person's life. Even after being directly rescued by angels, he couldn't shake off fear and insecurity. His behavior reminds us of how difficulties can paralyze us and prevent us from moving forward, even after we've been delivered from the worst. Lot's problem was not only external, but internal. The destruction of Sodom hadn't just demolished his home and possessions, it had also shattered his peace of mind. It was in this state of vulnerability that one of the most disturbing episodes in the Bible occurred. Isolated in the cave, Lot's daughters began to fear for their future. They believed that with no men around, their lineage would vanish. Desperation, combined with the influence of Sodom's corrupt culture, led them to an extreme decision. In a twisted plan, they decided to get their father drunk and have relations with him to ensure offspring. This event raises a serious question about the effects of a corrupt environment on people's minds. Even after escaping the city's destruction, Lot's daughters still carried the warped values of Sodom within them. Their mindset had been so shaped by the perverse society they grew up in that they saw no solution other than committing an incestuous act. This is a powerful lesson about how the influences around us can leave a deep mark, even when we physically distance ourselves from them. The Bible doesn't say much about Lot's reaction after this incident. We don't know if he ever realized what had happened or if he lived out his days tormented by it. What we do know is that from this act came two peoples, the Moabites and the Ammonites. These two nations, descendants of Lot's daughters, played a significant role in biblical history, often coming into conflict with Israel. The fact that the Moabites and Ammonites emerged from such a controversial event teaches us another profound truth. God can transform even the darkest circumstances into something with purpose. Centuries later, a Moabite woman named Ruth would become the great-grandmother of King David, and through her lineage, part of the genealogy of Jesus Christ. This twist in the story shows us that, despite human mistakes and tragedies, God remains in control, writing a greater story. Still, Lot's story serves as a warning about the consequences of our choices. He wasn't a wicked man like the inhabitants of Sodom, but his decision to live there put him in a dangerous position. His example shows how even the righteous can be negatively influenced when they become too entangled in a corrupt environment. His attachment to the city nearly cost him his life. His hesitation put him at risk, and his choices led to consequences that echoed through generations. The Apostle Peter, in his second epistle, describes Lot as a man who was daily distressed by the corruption of Sodom. This means he was never fully comfortable in that environment. He knew it was wrong, yet he stayed. How often do we find ourselves in similar situations? We know something isn't good for us, that we're drifting from God's principles, but we remain because it's convenient, because it seems like the best option materially, or because we fear the unknown. Lot was saved, but he left Sodom with deep scars. He lost his wife, his stability, and watched his family take destructive paths. He represents those who try to walk between two worlds, the world of faith and the world of material comfort. His story teaches us that we need to be mindful of our choices and the influences we allow into our lives. Another important aspect to highlight is the difference between how Abraham and Lot dealt with challenges. Abraham always sought God's direction before making decisions. He gave up wealth and opportunities to maintain his communion with the Lord. Lot, on the other hand, made choices based on his own logic and ended up suffering for it. This contrast between the two characters prompts us to reflect on how we make our own decisions. Are we trusting in God or relying solely on our own perceptions? In the New Testament, Jesus mentions the destruction of Sodom as an example of what will happen at the end of times. In Luke 17:28-30, he says, "As it was in the days of Lot, they were eating, drinking, buying, selling, planting, and building. But on the day Lot left Sodom, fire and brimstone rained from heaven and destroyed them all. So it will be on the day when the Son of Man is revealed. This reference reminds us that God's judgment is not just a thing of the past. Just as Sodom was destroyed for its corruption, the world will also face a final judgment. Lot's story isn't just an ancient tale. It's a warning for all of us. We need to be prepared, live with discernment, and not let ourselves be swayed by the influences of the world around us. Furthermore, Paul, in his letter to the Romans, warns us about the need for transformation and renewal of the mind so that we don't conform to this world's patterns. He writes in Romans 12:2, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." Lot couldn't fully transform his mind. He carried the weight of Sodom within him, and it deeply affected his life and his family's. That's why his story should serve as an example for us. We need to be attentive to our choices, trust God at all times, and avoid getting entangled in what can corrupt us. May we learn from Lot's mistakes and seek to live a life that reflects God's will. If this message spoke to your heart, leave your comment and share it with someone who needs to hear this story. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to receive more content like this. May God bless you abundantly and see you next time.